mother's funeral, a different man approached you and announced he instead is your father. Today to answer 25 years worth of their questions.
And put his hands around me and asked me, how is my beautiful little girl doing? So, Your Honor, I'm sitting here looking, stunned and trying to figure out what is this guy talking about as far as him being my biological father.
I told him, that these are my kids.
Knowing this is just a friend of your family.
Yes, Your Honor. Yes, Your Honor. Him and my mother when she was alive. My mother would say that she wasn't for sure Mr. Johnson, the defendant, was my biological father.
So the story would go back and forth?
Yes, ma'am.
Ever hear anything about their mother cheating, that someone else could be the father?
Yes, Your Honor.
You did?
Yes, Your Honor.
In Judge Lauren Lake's courtroom, the atmosphere feels heavy even before the session begins. The people who have walked in today carry years of unanswered questions, hidden stories, and emotional wounds that have shaped their lives. The moment they take their places, it becomes clear that this is not just another paternity case. This is a confrontation with the past. This is a moment where the truth finally interrupts decades of confusion. The two young women, Elizabeth Johnson and Melinda Davis, sit close to each other, their hands clasped tightly, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear, hope, and exhaustion. They have lived most of their lives believing the man sitting across from them, Roger Johnson Sr., is their father. Yet their journey to this courtroom started when an unexpected stranger approached them at their mother's funeral and whispered something that shook the foundations of their identities. He claimed he was their real father. That moment created a storm inside their hearts that still hasn't settled. Behind them sits their brother, who has lived with similar doubts but has always tried to stay strong for his sisters. This courtroom on this day is the stage where their long-buried questions will finally face the truth. The presence of DNA testing, a tool that has changed countless lives, will now determine the future of this family. It's the kind of moment that reminds people why DNA test people regret taking has become such a common phrase. Because sometimes the truth comforts, and sometimes it destroys. Judge Lauren Lake, known for her calm command of the courtroom and her deep empathy, surveys the family before her. This is not just a legal proceeding. This is a space where the relationship between law and justice reveals its complexity. In her courtroom, justice doesn't just mean statutes and evidence. It means healing, acknowledgement, and truth. And sometimes it means reopening old wounds so they can finally close properly. As the session begins, Judge Lake asks Elizabeth to explain what happened at the funeral. Elizabeth describes how she arrived expecting grief, only to be met with a mystery. She introduces the moment the stranger wrapped his arms around her as if he had known her his whole life and called her "my beautiful little girl." She recalls the confusion, the shock, and the disbelief. She remembers thinking this man must have mistaken her for someone else. But the stranger insisted he was her real father. From that day forward, the story of her life twisted into something unfamiliar. Judge Lake listens carefully, taking note of the emotional weight behind Elizabeth's words. She knows this courtroom deals with facts, DNA, and documentation, but the human heart cannot be ignored. She directs her attention to Roger Johnson, asking whether he had ever heard rumors that the mother had been unfaithful. Roger, a man who has raised these children alone, nods slowly. He admits that their mother had indeed confessed. She told him she was unhappy. She told him she had been seeing other men, while he worked long hours to provide for the family. He shares these details not with anger but with a heartbreaking honesty that reveals years of pain. He never had proof. He only had suspicion, a suspicion he buried because he chose to love the children unconditionally. Yet now those old doubts sit in the courtroom beside him, refusing to be ignored. Judge Lake asks him how he managed as a single father. Roger describes raising the girls, teaching them basic life skills, guiding them through emotional milestones and trying to be both mom and dad. He even used his talent for drawing to help them understand things visually. His voice cracks, and the courtroom falls silent. This is not just legal testimony. This is a man explaining how he built a family out of broken pieces. While emotions run high, Judge Lake shifts her focus to the structure of evidence. She explains how adverse inference in Evidence Act sometimes applies in general legal settings. When parties avoid testable truth, the law assumes the hidden truth may not be in their favor. She uses the concept lightly here, not as punishment, but as a teaching moment. She emphasizes that when people run from truth, whether in relationships, parenting, or court, it often catches up with them. The truth has a way of entering through the smallest cracks. This courtroom today is exactly where that truth arrives. The discussion turns to the official records. Roger presents the divorce papers that show their mother relinquished parental rights. Judge Lake reads aloud the lines that confirm he raised the children alone without support. The courtroom recognizes the weight of that sacrifice. These papers serve not just as legal documentation, but as evidence, the kind often discussed on legal analysis platforms like the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where stories of responsibility and justice intersect. The siblings describe their memories growing up. Elizabeth remembers moments when her mother took her to places that now, in hindsight, seem meaningful, like a car dealership where a man looked at her with emotion in his eyes. Melinda shares her own stories, including how she once met a boy who might have been her half-brother. The echoes of their mother's choices ripple into their adult lives, filling them with unanswered questions. Judge Lake acknowledges the emotional toll. She reminds the courtroom that this is what happens when truth is withheld for years. Families unravel, stories contradict, and identity fractures. It's similar to what people confess in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where truth finally emerges after years of hiding. The courtroom grows tense as their brother takes the stand. He admits that while he sees their father clearly in Elizabeth, he always wondered about Melinda. Not because he loved her less, but because the resemblance wasn't strong. Melinda breaks down, confessing that she once denied her father publicly, even at her wedding. She confesses she let another man walk her down the aisle because confusion and resentment overwhelmed her. Her father listens with tears in his eyes. He forgives her immediately. Judge Lake notes how this moment reflects one of the deepest concepts of justice in jurisprudence, that justice isn't only about punishment. Sometimes justice is forgiveness. Sometimes justice is acknowledging pain and letting it go. Before the DNA results are presented, Judge Lake explains the significance of DNA tests in legal settings. She mentions how, in divorce proceedings, in custody battles, and even on platforms like the Divorce Course podcast, these results often become pivotal moments where lives change direction. She also notes how these situations sometimes echo adoption stories' full episodes, where identity is re-examined in emotional ways. DNA testing is powerful. It is precise. And it is unforgiving. The results are brought into the courtroom. The envelopes are placed on Judge Lake's desk with the gravity of final judgment. Everyone holds their breath. This is the moment that can reshape narratives, rewrite identities, and end years of emotional confusion. Judge Lake opens the first envelope. She reads the results for the brother. The courtroom reacts. Relief washes over him. He is indeed the biological child of Roger Johnson. Judge Lake opens the second envelope for Elizabeth. Once again, the result confirms her biological connection to her father. Tears fall. Years of confusion dissolve instantly. But the courtroom feels the tension rising as they prepare for the final envelope, the one for Melinda, who struggled the most with identity and acceptance. Her hands shake. Her father looks at her with the same love he always had. Judge Lake reads the result, and the truth lands with the softness of closure. The moment the final DNA result is read, a silence spreads through the courtroom, one that carries relief, disbelief, healing, and release all at once. When Judge Lauren Lake confirms that Melinda, too, is the biological daughter of Roger Johnson, something deep inside the family shifts. The truth, long hidden behind confusion and inconsistent memories, finally stands clear. And with that truth comes a weight lifted from generations of uncertainty. Melinda breaks down, overwhelmed not only by the result but by the realization that the man she doubted, rejected, and emotionally distanced herself from was, in fact, her father all along. The guilt she carried for years becomes visible on her face, but her father reaches for her emotionally in the only way he knows, through patience, forgiveness, and unconditional love. This moment echoes what many people share in emotional recovery circles, similar to what is often expressed in Celebrate Recovery testimonies. The realization that past choices were shaped by pain, not by truth. The courtroom breathes again, but Judge Lake is not finished. She often says that truth is the beginning, not the end. Now that the biological facts are established, the emotional work can finally begin. She explains that DNA results do more than identify parents. They restore or redefine relationships. She reminds the family that today's truth has the power to change everything, echoing the theme so deeply explored in shows like Truth Changes Everything podcast. While speaking, she transitions into a broader reflection about the relationship between law and justice, noting that families often feel lost in between those two ideas. Law deals with evidence, timelines, and documentation. Justice deals with emotion, humanity, harm, and healing. Today, both law and justice stood side by side. The evidence provided clarity, and the emotional responses allowed the family to understand one another with new compassion. The courtroom feels lighter now, not because the story was easy, but because the uncertainty is gone. Judge Lake takes a moment to remind them that the DNA testing process, while scientific and precise, can lead people into emotional territory they never expected. She mentions how common it has become for DNA test people regret taking to trend online, not because the tests are wrong, but because the truth they reveal often disrupts the stories people have told themselves for years. But in this case, the truth has brought unity, not separation. The siblings look at one another with a new sense of grounding. They finally understand that their father never abandoned them, never doubted them out of neglect, and never tried to hide anything from them. He simply raised them the best he could with the limited information he had. And now the DNA results validate his faith, his effort, and his sacrifices. After announcing the results, Judge Lake moves into another legal explanation, this time addressing how courts handle long-buried paternity issues. She connects the concept to general legal teachings, referencing how issues of missing evidence or delayed truth often relate to principles seen in the Adverse Inference in Evidence Act, where avoiding clarity can have legal consequences. Although she doesn't apply it directly in this case, she uses it to teach the family and the audience that evading truth only delays healing. She also talks about how paternity ties into larger legal themes like custody, inheritance, and responsibilities. These matters often emerge in episodes of the Divorce Course podcast, where legal experts explain how family relationships can collapse or transform depending on the evidence presented. In this courtroom, though, the focus isn't divorce. The focus is identity. And identity is a powerful force, powerful enough to shape a person's view of love, loyalty, and justice for decades. The siblings listen intently as Judge Lake describes how different people come to terms with their identity at different stages in life. For some, Discovering the truth about parentage earlier might have changed the course of their development. For others, finding out later becomes a turning point. She mentions how these cases often echo emotional stories from families featured in adoption stories' full episodes, where individuals realize that DNA is just one piece of the puzzle. Love, care, effort, and presence matter just as much. As she speaks, the brother nods. He knows firsthand that love and loyalty hold a family together more strongly than biology alone. He reflects on the years he watched their father work tirelessly, guide them, teach them, and love them even when he wasn't sure if he was connected to them by blood. His respect for his father deepens in that moment, knowing now that the DNA test confirms what his heart sensed all along. Judge Lake turns her attention to Roger Johnson, acknowledging his strength. She explains how rare it is for a father to remain present, consistent, and emotionally available when doubts linger for decades. Many cases she sees involve men who give up easily, or who carry resentment so deep it becomes impossible to parent effectively. She praises Roger for rising above the confusion. His actions reflect what justice seeks to protect: children's well-being, identity, and security. The courtroom responds emotionally to her words. Roger wipes away tears, as do his children. The truth has not only validated his role, it has honored his sacrifices. Judge Lake then shifts to an important legal discussion regarding medical history. Since Melinda's children are experiencing medical challenges, she explains how confirming biological relationships is essential for doctors, specialists, and genetic counselors. She highlights how the law often intersects with health decisions, something even the Supreme Court child support discussions sometimes touch on when medical needs come into play. Now that the biological truth is confirmed, Melinda's children can receive accurate information about family medical history from both sides. This knowledge can prevent future medical complications or help doctors identify genetic conditions earlier. The entire family seems relieved by this clarity. They understand that DNA testing was not just about the past, it was about protecting the future. Judge Lake continues explaining how identity issues often play out in the legal system, referencing examples similar to those discussed in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where complex family issues meet legal strategy. The attorney-like reasoning she provides helps the family understand why the court system handles paternity cases so carefully. It is not only about determining who is responsible, but about ensuring that truth supports justice. The emotional tone of the room continues to shift from tension to closure. The siblings reflect aloud, expressing how the years of rumor, confusion, and inconsistent stories from their mother shaped the way they saw themselves. They talk about how growing up with multiple possible fathers in their minds made their adolescence confusing. Each memory they revisit now feels different through the lens of truth. Judge Lake acknowledges that emotional confusion from childhood often resurfaces in adulthood, especially in major life events, like weddings, pregnancies, or conflicts with their own families. She mentions that many similar cases appear on the Divorce Course podcast, where adults unpack childhood experiences that shape their romantic decisions and self-worth. Melinda quietly admits she pushed her father away because she didn't know who she truly belonged to. Now, the truth gives her a path toward reconciliation. Judge Lake tells her that understanding her own story is the first step toward healing the next generation, because children absorb their parents' confusion even when no words are spoken. As the family processes the results, Judge Lake recenters the courtroom on the power of truth. She emphasizes that DNA does not erase the past, but it can reshape the future. She reminds them that factual truth is only a foundation. Emotional truth, forgiveness, and responsibility are what build a lasting family. She also notes how common it is for people involved in complex paternity cases to find themselves searching for clarity through podcasts, books, legal shows, and discussions. She mentions that some people explore conversations on the Truth Changes Everything podcast, where individuals talk about how a single piece of evidence changed the direction of their lives. Others look to faith-based recovery circles, like those who share emotional healing journeys through Celebrate Recovery testimonies. The Johnson family's story parallels those transformations, where truth feels painful at first, but ultimately liberates. Before bringing the courtroom to a close, Judge Lake makes one final point. Justice requires courage. It takes courage to question family stories. It takes courage to confront painful memories. It takes courage to take a DNA test, especially when you fear what you might learn. And it takes courage to walk into a courtroom and allow the truth to be spoken aloud in front of the world. The Johnson family demonstrated that courage today. As the courtroom settles into a calmer rhythm, Judge Lauren Lake leans forward with that signature blend of authority and compassion she is known for. She reminds the family that the journey does not end with DNA results. In fact, she explains, many families find that the hardest part begins after the truth is revealed. The process of rebuilding trust, understanding one another, and redefining relationships is long, delicate, and deeply emotional. She notes that the courtroom served as a place where law demanded clarity, but now the healing must take place in their personal lives, spaces where law cannot dictate actions, but justice and love can. This is where the true relationship between law and justice is revealed. The law gives answers, while justice asks people to decide what they will do with those answers. The Johnson siblings embrace one another quietly. For the first time in their lives, there is no doubt, no shadow, no alternative story to fear. Their identities feel settled, anchored whole. And their father, who spent decades quietly carrying the burden of uncertainty, finally breathes in peace. The truth has affirmed what his heart always knew. Judge Lake turns her attention back to the courtroom at large, extending her explanation to the broader implications. She shares that many families who appear before her are caught between conflicting stories, unverified claims, or emotional fog created by years of miscommunication. Cases like this highlight why DNA evidence is such a powerful force in modern family law. It brings finality, something that emotional stories alone cannot provide. She further explains how paternity issues sometimes intersect with legal matters such as custody arrangements, medical history disclosures, and even financial responsibilities like child support. In some cases, these issues escalate all the way to high-level judicial review, becoming part of discussions similar to those in Supreme Court child support deliberations. The Johnson case, though deeply emotional, remains grounded in a clear truth now backed by DNA evidence. Judge Lake emphasizes that scientific clarity often removes the ambiguity that destabilizes family relationships. She talks about how many people share similar journeys on podcasts like the Divorce Course podcast, where couples explore how hidden truths, past infidelity, or unresolved questions eventually unravel relationships. But she also highlights the opposite, stories where truth becomes the turning point that rebuilds families rather than breaking them apart. The courtroom becomes quiet again, reflecting on her words. She then shifts the focus to the siblings themselves. She notes that Elizabeth, Melinda, and their brother each experienced different emotional journeys under the same roof, because each child absorbed their mother's confusion in different ways. This is a common phenomenon in fractured families and is often described in psychological analyses and Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where individuals explain how their childhood uncertainties shaped their adult behavior, fears, and decisions. Judge Lake acknowledges Elizabeth's strength, her ability to confront the truth even when it frightened her. She acknowledges Melinda's courage to admit mistakes and seek forgiveness. And she acknowledges the brother's role as the steady presence, the one who held the emotional threads together even while dealing with his own doubts. Turning again to the father, she acknowledges that he has been through the kind of emotional turmoil that few men speak openly about. His story resembles the kind of painful yet powerful moments discussed on the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where real-life crises intersect with legal and personal responsibility. Roger Johnson stood firm through uncertainty, false assumptions, and emotional confusion. And today, the truth rewards him for that faithfulness. The courtroom reflects on the cost of untruths. The family speaks briefly about the years when their mother offered contradictory stories. Times she said one man was the father, then later changed her mind. They recall the confusion of growing up with different potential father figures, each story shaping how they saw themselves. Judge Lake gently explains that this inconsistency creates emotional instability, especially for children who rely on certainty as they form their sense of self. She mentions how similar cases become educational conversations in legal discussions or psychological analyses, such as those found in the Truth Changes Everything podcast, where a single revelation transforms the entire direction of a person's life. That is what is happening here. Truth has reshaped the Johnson family's narrative, both individually and collectively. The conversation continues into deeper reflections. The siblings speak about how growing up with unclear paternity affected their relationships as adults, how trust became difficult, how love felt conditional, and how identity felt fragile. Melinda admits that her fear of abandonment influenced many choices she made, including who she married and how she treated her father. She explains that, for years, she acted out of the emotional confusion created by never knowing where she truly belonged. Judge Lake listens with sincere empathy. She explains that these emotional outcomes, mistrust, insecurity, pushing people away, are common themes in complex family stories. They are often discussed in therapeutic spaces or in deeply vulnerable formats like adoption stories, full episodes, where people talk about the long-term effects of hidden truths or missing pieces of their identity. Now that the truth is confirmed, Judge Lake encourages the family to actively rebuild trust. She tells them that DNA results do not automatically fix the years of emotional damage. Reconnection requires honest communication, patience, and shared effort. It requires acknowledging the pain, not pretending it never existed. She recommends they take what they learned from the courtroom and bring those lessons into their daily lives. Truth must be honored through action. The father expresses his hope for the future. He explains that he no longer fears the big question, am I their real father? Because now he knows without doubt. His only concern now is rebuilding the closeness he once shared with his daughters. He wants to be present not only as a biological father, but as a grandfather who can support the medical needs of his grandchildren. Judge Lake underscores this responsibility. She points out that biological truth now allows doctors and specialists to navigate the children's medical concerns more accurately. This, she says, is one of the most practical and powerful outcomes of paternity testing, one that goes far beyond emotional closure. She emphasizes that law and love must now work together. The DNA test provided clarity, which is the legal part, but emotional healing must guide what happens next. This is what justice looks like outside of the courtroom. As she prepares to close the session, Judge Lake reflects again on the role of truth. She explains that truth can disrupt, heal, or redefine, but it always clarifies. And clarity is often the foundation on which relationships, families, and futures are built. She explains that the Johnson family is now in a position to restore what was lost, strengthen what remains, and protect the next generation from repeating old cycles. She also explains how this entire case serves as an example of why DNA testing has become widely discussed, even controversial, in modern society. People share DNA test cheating stories, stories of unexpected siblings, hidden affairs, or surprising ancestral connections. Some people find healing, others find heartbreak. And sometimes, as seen in this courtroom, people find both. The Johnson family's journey mirrors those complex emotions. The truth hurt, healed, and transformed them all at once. Before dismissing the case, Judge Lake reminds them once more that this courtroom is not the end of their journey. It is the beginning of a new chapter, one where truth stands as the foundation, not fear or rumor. She gently encourages them to seek therapy if needed, to communicate without hesitation, and to give one another space to heal at their own pace. The family stands together as the courtroom session concludes. Their tears now reflect relief instead of fear. Their posture shows unity instead of division. But most importantly, their hearts feel lighter. The weight of uncertainty that haunted them for years has finally been lifted. Outside the courtroom, people often talk about how paternity cases feel like emotional earthquakes. But sometimes, after the shaking stops, people discover that the foundation beneath them is stronger than they imagined. That is what the Johnson family discovers as they walk out of Judge Lauren Lake's courtroom. The truth didn't break them, it rebuilt them. And this is why, despite the emotional complexity, truth remains the most powerful force in any family's story.